Beeman Titus sat in the familiar, dimly lit office of Dr. Lathra, the woman who had patiently worked with him for years. The air felt heavy, charged with an intensity that often accompanied their sessions. Beeman's jaw tightened as he clenched his fists, trying to fight the urge to bolt out the door. Dr. Lathra's steady gaze met his, and she leaned forward, her voice gentle yet firm. "We need to revisit the past," she said. "The trauma that brought you here." Beeman's eyes flickered, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His breathing grew shallow. The word trauma hung in the air, echoing in his mind. After what felt like an eternity, he exhaled slowly, resigning himself to the task he had avoided for so long. He nodded, the movement almost imperceptible. "Fine," he whispered, his voice gruff. "Let's do it." As he closed his eyes, the office around him dissolved, and he was transported back to a place that had shaped him, scarred him. The underground rings and arena unlike any other, buried deep beneath the polished facade of a futuristic metropolis. He could almost feel the electric hum of the crowd, their energy pulsing through his veins. The rings were a spectacle of brutality, a place where warriors with cybernetic and genetic enhancements fought in matches that were as much about survival as they were about victory. Beeman recalled the enhancements, the lengths to which fighters would go to gain even the smallest advantage. His own body was a testament to such modifications, his muscles reinforced with nanofibers, his reflexes sharpened by neural augmentations. But in the rings, even the most heavily modified fighters had to adhere to a strict set of rules, designed to keep the matches fair, or at least as fair as possible, when augmented limbs could break bones with a single blow. He opened his eyes briefly, meeting Dr. Lathra's calm but expectant expression. Her patience never wavered, but he could tell she was waiting for him to delve deeper. Beeman inhaled sharply and continued, his voice thick with emotion. "It was supposed to be just another fight," he said. But then came the human. He paused, the memories crashing over him like a tidal wave. Humans were a rarity in the rings. Their sheer physical strength and unpredictable nature made them dangerous, so much so that they were officially banned. But this particular human had somehow found his way into a match, and his presence had shattered every expectation Beeman had ever held. The human was more than just strong, Beeman murmured. He was something else. He described the first time he saw the fighter known as the Juggernaut. The human stood in the center of the arena, his posture deceptively relaxed, his muscles coiled like a predator's. There was something unsettling about him, something beyond his massive frame and powerful build. Beeman recalled the fighter's eyes cold, lifeless, almost machine-like. Those eyes had bored into him, leaving a chill that no amount of adrenaline could shake. The core conflict crystallized in that moment. Beeman had faced countless opponents, warriors engineered to be faster, stronger, more ruthless. But the human was different, and it wasn't just his physical prowess that made him so. There was an aura of inevitability about him, as though defeat at his hands was preordained. Beeman's pulse raced as he relived the feeling of standing across from this terrifying force of nature. Dr. Lathra's voice interrupted his reverie, drawing him back just enough to keep him anchored. "What made him so dangerous?" she asked softly. Beeman's throat constricted. He remembered the whispers he'd heard before the fight, rumors of why humans had been banned in the first place. It wasn't merely because of their strength, it was something far deeper, something that twisted the very fabric of competition. The human represented a threat to the balance the rings had meticulously maintained, a primal danger that defied the augmented warrior's carefully calculated strategies. "He wasn't supposed to be there," Beeman continued, his voice cracking. "And when I faced him, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: fear." He described the ominous build-up to their clash. The noise of the crowd faded to a dull roar as he stood in the arena, every instinct screaming at him to run. Yet he couldn't. The rules dictated that a fight, once begun, had to end with one combatant victorious. Beeman's heart thudded in his chest as he relived those moments, every second drawn out, every breath filled with dread. The Juggernaut moved with an unsettling grace, his every step calculated. Beeman had spent a lifetime fighting machines and warriors enhanced beyond recognition, but this human fighter moved as if he transcended humanity. Beeman's own augmentations felt almost inadequate in comparison, as though every upgrade, every enhancement, suddenly amounted to nothing. Suspense gripped the room as Beeman described the first clash, the collision of raw, unstoppable force with refined, augmented skill. His fists clenched once more, and his body tensed as he remembered the impact, the shattering pain that coursed through his limbs. It had been a moment of realization, the start of a fight that would strip him of more than just his strength. It would take a part of his soul. Beeman's voice dropped to a whisper. That was when everything changed. He looked at Dr. Lathra, his expression haunted, eyes clouded with grief and regret. The session had only just begun, but the weight of the story pressed down on him like a crushing tide. Dr. Lathra waited, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm of his memories. And so the stage was set. Beeman's voice trembled slightly as he recounted the final moments before the clash began, his mind unable to shake the images that were seared into his memory. The office of Dr. Lathra fell away once more, and he was back in the underground arena, surrounded by a sea of faceless, roaring spectators. The energy was electric, a living thing that coiled around him, amplifying his heartbeat until it felt like it would burst through his chest. The arena lights blazed, cutting through the darkness and illuminating the crimson-stained floor, the metallic scent of old blood mingling with sweat and oil. Every footstep reverberated, each impact of flesh against reinforced surfaces echoing in Beeman's ears. He took in every detail, from the glint of polished cybernetic limbs to the raw, unrestrained excitement of the crowd. The sensory overload made him feel both alive and trapped, a prisoner to the violent spectacle that demanded sacrifice. He could still picture the human fighter standing across from him, a being out of place in a world designed for the enhanced. The man's eyes were devoid of humanity, emotionless and cold, like two glass marbles reflecting nothing but void. Beeman felt a primal unease, a warning from some ancient part of his brain that this opponent was beyond what he had faced before. The human seemed impossibly still, a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A bell rang, shattering the fragile pause and igniting the chaos. Beeman launched forward, his augmented legs propelling him with inhuman speed. He led with a left hook, a blow that could shatter bone, but the human twisted aside, dodging with a fluidity that left Beeman off balance. The crowd's roar faded to white noise as he regained his footing, using his neural enhancements to calculate the angles, the momentum. This wasn't just a fight, it was a deadly game of chess. He threw a series of punches, his movements precise and lethal. One landed, dislocating the human's arm with a sickening pop. Beeman almost expected his opponent to crumble, but instead, the human merely tilted his head, an eerie expressionless mask, and reset his limb with a bone-crunching snap. The human came at him, fists flying with a ferocity that was hard to comprehend. Beeman barely blocked the first strike and felt the second slam into his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. Pain flashed through Beeman's body, but he pushed it aside, his training and augmentations kicking in to keep him moving. He managed to get inside the human's guard, landing a devastating knee to the stomach. The human doubled over but refused to fall, and the realization began to sink in this opponent's resilience wasn't just unnatural, it was monstrous. A wave of panic surged through Beeman, something he hadn't felt in years. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was witnessing. The human should have been broken, bloodied, and beaten, but he kept rising, his eyes never wavering. Beeman's enhanced heart pumped faster, his breath ragged. His neural implants, designed to optimize his combat strategies, started to falter under the weight of his fear. Every calculation told him he should be winning, but reality defied logic. Dr. Lathra's voice from the present whispered into the edges of his consciousness, grounding him briefly, but he shook it off, returning to the memory that haunted him. The crowd's cheers seemed to blend into a deafening, pulsating beat as the fight devolved into raw survival. Beeman's body ached, his hands bruised and bleeding. His strikes became wild, fueled more by desperation than precision. The human staggered but kept moving forward, relentless, his movements almost mechanical yet terrifyingly alive. It was as though he were a force of nature, an inevitability that would not be denied. Beeman's internal systems blared warnings. His muscles burned and exhaustion clawed at the edges of his mind, but he refused to back down, Each moment pushed him closer to a breaking point, where rationality was beginning to erode. The instinct to survive, to dominate, stirred dangerously within him. The crowd's chants mixed with a roar that Beeman realized was coming from his own throat, a guttural, animalistic sound. And then, the unthinkable happened. A sharp, searing pain exploded in his skull as his focus chip, an essential implant that kept his instincts in check, shattered. The safety mechanism, the piece of technology designed to suppress his primal impulses, had failed. He stumbled, clutching his head as a wave of raw, uncontrollable rage surged through him. The world seemed to blur, colors bleeding into one another, and the human fighter in front of him became nothing more than a target, an obstacle he needed to obliterate. Beeman felt his control slipping, his carefully honed discipline crumbling into dust. The line between man and beast blurred as his vision narrowed, his pulse a deafening drumbeat. He was about to cross into something he could never come back from, something brutal, irreversible. The human moved closer and Beeman braced himself, knowing that the fight had become more than just a battle of strength or skill. It was a battle for his very soul. Beeman's entire world narrowed to the face of the human in front of him, his focus chip shattered and his instincts roaring unchecked. All he could feel was the blinding surge of rage, a primal drive that overpowered every sense of reason. His vision tunneled, colors swirling at the edges, and he lunged forward, fists flying. He wasn't Beeman Titus, a trained warrior. He was something else now, something monstrous. His fists connected with flesh, the impact reverberating up his arms, jolting his entire body. The human staggered, his eyes vacant yet still oddly focused, and Beeman swung again. The crowd blurred around him, their chants echoing like distant thunder, their voices reduced to a cacophony that only fueled the fire inside him. He couldn't hear anything but the roaring in his own ears, the blood pounding in his veins. Blow after blow, his hands began to feel numb, his knuckles splitting open, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The human fell to the ground, but Beeman followed him down, his entire body driven by something far beyond training or strategy. His fists pounded into the human's face, the skin splitting beneath the force, blood spattering across the arena floor. The man beneath him struggled, but each movement only seemed to amplify Beeman's rage. He remembered the taste of bile rising in his throat, a cold, detached part of his mind recognizing the brutality of his actions, even as his body refused to relent. He was a predator, lost in the thrill of the kill, the boundaries between man and beast completely shattered. His opponent wasn't just a fighter, he was prey, a target that needed to be destroyed. The human's eyes, once cold and lifeless, now filled with terror and emotion that seemed almost alien in the blood-soaked arena. Beeman heard bones crack, the dull, sickening sound reverberating in his ears, but it felt distant, like he was watching himself from the outside. His own body ached, his cybernetic enhancements pushed to their limits. He felt his own ribs screaming in protest, his muscles tearing, but it didn't matter. There was nothing left except the overwhelming need to dominate, to destroy. The crowd's chants grew louder, their voices merging into a single deafening roar. Blood smeared across Beeman's face, the metallic tang filling his nostrils, mixing with the sweat and grime of the fight. His hands were a blur of movement, striking, hitting, pounding until his knuckles felt like shattered glass. The human was limp beneath him, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but Beeman couldn't stop. He was lost, beyond reason, beyond anything remotely human. Suddenly something shifted. It was as though a veil had lifted, the red haze dissipating just enough for him to see clearly, if only for a moment. The human lay beneath him, unmoving, his face a mess of blood and bruises. The terror in his eyes had faded, replaced by a vacant stare, and Beeman felt something inside him break. The fire that had consumed him flickered, and a cold, hollow dread took its place. He stopped, his bloodied fists hovering above the human's body, trembling. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he looked down at his opponent, no longer an enemy, no longer a threat, just a broken, lifeless figure. His own hands, once precise instruments of combat, were ruined, his knuckles shattered, his forearms swollen and bruised. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't respond. Panic gripped him as he realized he couldn't move, the adrenaline draining from his system, leaving only pain and exhaustion in its wake. Beeman collapsed to the side, his body giving out, and the world around him dissolved into chaos. The crowd that had moments ago been cheering now erupted in confusion, medics rushing forward, the shrill blare of alarms echoing through the arena. He was vaguely aware of people shouting, of hands pulling him away, but it all felt distant, like he was underwater, everything muffled and blurred. His vision wavered, and he caught a glimpse of the human fighter, his body lifeless, his chest still. The realization struck him like a physical blow. He had killed him. In his rage and his blind, uncontrollable fury, he had gone too far. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The weight of that knowledge settled over him, crushing him, suffocating him. The world around him seemed to fade, and all that was left was the body on the floor, the life he had taken. The fight was over, but the consequences had only just begun. Days later, Beeman sat in his hospital room, his body covered in bandages, his legs immobilized. His career was over, his reputation in ruins, but none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the image that haunted him every time he closed his eyes, the lifeless body of the man he had killed. The scandal had erupted almost immediately, news feeds and media outlets plastering his face across every screen, the once glorious galactic warrior now a symbol of unchecked violence, a failure. But the worst part wasn't the loss of his career or the public's outrage. The worst part was the crushing guilt, the knowledge that he had taken a life in a moment of uncontrolled rage. He had trained for years, honing his skills, becoming the best. And yet, in that moment, he had lost everything that made him who he was. He had become the very thing he had always fought against, a mindless, unfeeling predator. Dr. Lathra's presence was a quiet comfort, her voice gentle as she listened to him recount the events, her expression never wavering. Beeman's voice broke more than once, the weight of his guilt almost too much to bear, but she stayed with him, her calm gaze anchoring him, giving him the strength to continue. There might have been more at play, she said quietly when he finally fell silent, her words cutting through the fog of his memories. Beeman looked at her, confusion flickering across his features. She spoke of manipulation, of forces beyond the arena, of a system that thrived on violence, on broken warriors like him. Beeman's mind reeled, trying to process what she was saying. Had he been a pawn? Had there been more to the human's presence in the ring than he had realized? The thought was almost too much, but it also offered a strange, fragile hope. Perhaps he wasn't solely to blame. Perhaps there was something more, something beyond his control. Dr. Lathra reached out, placing a hand on his. "You're not beyond redemption, Beeman," she said softly. Her words hung in the air, a lifeline in the darkness that surrounded him. Beeman closed his eyes, her words echoing in his mind. He wasn't sure if he could ever forgive himself, but maybe, just maybe, he could start to understand, to find a way forward. The quiet of the room settled around them, and for the first time in a long time, Beeman felt something other than rage or fear. It was a fragile thing, a tiny spark of hope, but it was enough to keep him from falling apart. Beeman sat in the quiet stillness of the therapy room, his body heavy with the weight of everything he had just recounted. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and he struggled to keep his breathing steady. His hands, still bandaged and immobile, rested in his lap like remnants of his failure, his guilt. He stared at the floor, unable to meet Dr. Lathra's gaze, the image of the human he had killed still haunting him. Dr. Lathra leaned forward slightly, her calm, measured voice breaking through the oppressive silence. "Beeman," she began, and he braced himself, expecting judgment, maybe even anger. Instead, there was a tenderness in her tone, a warmth that he couldn't quite understand. "There's something you need to know." His eyes flickered up to hers, confusion replacing some of the anguish that had taken root in his heart. She took a breath, her gaze steady, and began to speak. "The human you fought, the man you killed, was my father." Beeman's world tilted, the revelation striking him like a physical blow. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Shock rendered him speechless, and he felt his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a painful reminder of the life he had taken. Dr. Lathra's eyes softened as she continued, her voice carrying a quiet grief that had clearly lived in her for a long time. "My father, Rael, wasn't supposed to be in that ring," she said. "He was a loving man, but life broke him in ways I could never fully understand. When my mother fell ill, he turned to desperate measures to provide for us. Fighting in the rings was his way of making sure we survived, even if it meant risking his life. Her voice trembled slightly, but she held steady, her composure a testament to years of processing her own trauma. Beeman's mind spun as he tried to piece together this new information. Rael had fought not out of greed or pride but out of love and desperation. The weight of his guilt crushed him even further, the knowledge that he had not just taken a life but shattered a family's hope. He struggled to breathe, his chest heaving as he fought to hold back the tidal wave of emotion threatening to drown him. I'm so sorry, he choked out, his voice breaking. Tears burned in his eyes, and he looked away, unable to bear the pain in Dr. Lathra's eyes. I didn't know. His words crumbled, and he buried his face in his hands, the sobs ripping through him, raw and uncontainable. All the walls he had built, all the defenses he had clung to, shattered in that moment. Dr. Lathra's expression softened even further, and she reached across the small table between them, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Beeman, she said, her voice gentle but firm, you didn't know. And what happened? It was a tragedy, yes, but it's not the whole story. He lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen, searching her face for any sign of condemnation. Instead, he found something he hadn't expected: forgiveness. My father made his choices, she continued. And in a way, your actions, though terrible, did save my mother. The money he earned from fighting paid for her treatment. It gave her a second chance, and it gave me a future. Beeman was stunned. The idea that his violence, his loss of control, could have somehow led to something good was almost impossible to comprehend. The guilt still weighed heavily on him, but Dr. Lathra's words created a small, fragile crack in the darkness that had enveloped him for so long. I've hated you, she admitted, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I've hated you for what you did. But I've also had to learn to forgive you, to forgive the world for what happened to my family. And now, seeing you here, carrying this burden, I see that you've punished yourself more than anyone else ever could. Beeman's tears continued to fall, but something inside him shifted. The overwhelming self-loathing he had carried for years began to loosen its grip, just slightly. He still felt the crushing weight of what he had done, but her words held a glimmer of hope, a possibility he had never dared to imagine. Dr. Lathra sat back, her expression contemplative. You deserve a chance to heal, she said softly. Physically and emotionally, you're not beyond redemption, Beeman. You've suffered enough. She paused, letting her words sink in. I want you to consider getting the cybernetic replacements for your arms and legs, not as a way to return to fighting, but as a way to live again. He looked at her, disbelief and awe mingling in his eyes. You think I deserve that? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. Yes, because healing isn't just about making amends to others. It's also about forgiving yourself and moving forward. Beeman sat in stunned silence, her words echoing through him. For so long, he had believed he was beyond redemption, trapped in a cycle of guilt and self-punishment. But here she was, offering him a lifeline, a way to rebuild, to become something more than his mistakes. Slowly, he allowed himself to consider it, the possibility of healing, of accepting the help he had long denied himself. The road ahead would be long and painful, but perhaps it was a road worth traveling. He thought of Rael, of the life he had taken, and vowed silently to honor that life by living his own with purpose and meaning. Dr. Lathra's forgiveness was not a magic cure, but it was a start, a chance. Beeman felt a small, fragile hope take root, and he held on to it, knowing it might be the key to finding redemption, to learning to live with himself. He met Dr. Lathra's eyes, and for the first time in years he managed a small, grateful smile. The path forward would be difficult, but he was ready to take the first step.